Success.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, success. We've just had a few technical glitches, as is wont to happen, but you're all in. Morning, Di. We might just give it a minute or so just for people to pop in, and we wanted to start a bit early, but we had a glitch. I think we might get going. Di, if you want to start us off, thanks. You're on mute at the moment. We need to unmute her, I think. Sorry, everybody.
Have you unmuted on your end, Di?
The microphone just came on for a second.
You unmute. Great. All right, I have a loud mic. Does it unmute it now? Oh, bother.
Can we unmute everybody?
Sorry, everybody.
Little button saying mute all. I won't press on that.
All right, does that work?
We're good to go.
Sorry about that.
Hold on. No problem. Good morning, everyone. I warmly welcome you all to this morning's event. Thank you for joining us as we reflect on the responses to the Royal Commission into violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation of people with disability, and we consider the ways forward. My name's Diana Mallam, and I'm Chair of the Board of Management at Advocacy for Inclusion. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Canberrans and pay my respects to their elders past and present. AFI thanks the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people for their ongoing custodianship of the plains, mountains and rivers of Canberra. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our DPO and DRO colleagues, as well as Dr. Rhonda Galbally, AC, former Commission of the Disability Royal Commission. I understand that we'll be hearing from Rhonda and some of you shortly. We also have some messages which we'll be reading from people who would have very much liked to have been here. I note that Barbara Bennett, PSM, former Commissioner of the Disability Royal Commission, would have liked to have joined our forum today to hear other people's responses and thoughts and share any of her insights. But unfortunately, she's unable to join us today. Advocacy for Inclusion thought it was important for us to come together following the release of the report a fortnight ago. I think we all share some disappointment that the federal government in particular hasn't supported some of the main recommendations. We need to publicly acknowledge the effort, courage and the trauma involved in our story, in telling our stories to the Commission. Our board also acknowledges the significant contribution made by people to our Royal Commission project over 3.5 years, including our own outreach project. Today is about saying that you were heard, and even if the government isn't always listening, we're committed to carrying the torch and ensuring that the report results in lasting change. I'd now like to hand over to Craig Wallace, Acting CEO of AFI, to take us through these reflections.
Thanks, Di. Really great. Thanks for joining us this morning. It's really great to have such a supportive board in the work that we do. I'd also acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra, and we're all respectively meeting on the lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Before we begin, I'll start with some housekeeping. So this is a webinar format, so we've got everybody muted, but if you're wanting to speak, please raise a hand using the raise hand function or pop something in chat as we go, and we'll call on you. We are recording today's forum. If you've got any concerns, please let our team know in the chat. Carla Milner Bradley, who you can see online, is available to support you, as am I. We've got captions enabled in Teams for this session. If you need to use them, please go to the More tab at the top of your screen, click on Language and Speech and enable captions, and they will appear for you. If any of the issues discussed today cause concern, we will be putting some ways to seek support in the chat. We are very mindful that discussion of the Royal Commission and its contents and the evidence that many people gave can be a source of trauma and triggering to people who've experienced violence, abuse and neglect, and we want to ensure people are supported today. I'm going to begin by just talking a little bit about what's happened and about the Royal Commission. So the Commission's findings late last year highlighted the violence, abuse and neglect and exploitation faced by people with disabilities. They drew on the personal testimony of thousands of people with disability in open and closed sessions. The Commissioners with Disability, along with Commissioner Bennett, worked hard to amplify our voice in the final report. Here at AFI, we spent years on projects to support people to give evidence to the Commission, including people in situations of risk, like detainees at the Alexander McConaughey Centre. Back in March, ACT organisations issued a shared statement setting out our expectations in the response. This was joined by organisations like ACT, Down Syndrome and Intellectual Disability, Women with Disability ACT, and the Mental Health Consumer Coalition of the ACT. We called for action, and we'll drop a link to this in the response in the chat. Since the Commission reported last year, Advocacy for Inclusion has also contributed to some national discussions urging timely and concerted advocacy work to ensure that people with disabilities received a return from the vast financial and emotional investment made towards the Commission. And I think we need to acknowledge this did cost a lot of money, over $500 million, and it also involved people with disability ripping the Band-Aid repeatedly off a lot of trauma that people had experienced and pouring that into the Commission and trusting that governments would follow up adequately and respond and hear those voices. Despite all of this, and despite all of the efforts of the disability community, only 13 recommendations have been fully accepted by the Commonwealth after 9 months, with many remaining unresolved. Many crucial recommendations have been set aside or noted. These included proposals for a Disability Rights Act, a new cross-cutting national disability agreement, a Minister for Disability, removing sub-award wages, moving away from segregated schools and housing, plus a national approach to ending non-therapeutic sterilisation. So some of the big things they've set aside, but also some things that, frankly, we would have regarded as low-hanging fruit that they could have adopted were also not taken up by governments. Having said that, there are some points of light. So there is a commitment, for instance, to modernise the Disability Discrimination Act and to remove discriminatory elements of the Migration Act. Here in the ACT, there are some positive work agendas from the disability strategies, and the Territory has also accepted some key recommendations. So, for instance, in contrast to other jurisdictions, the ACT is the only jurisdiction to fully accept raising the minimal age of criminal responsibility. I note that Queensland's actually walked back from that today, so I think that is a significant policy piece. It is also the only jurisdiction to fully accept updating the national standards for public advocates, public guardians, and public trustee. The public trustee arrangements, including here in the ACT, is something that AFI has got a watchful eye on in our advocacy. In contrast to the Commonwealth, the ACT also expressed its support for the creation of a specific national disability agreement to guide funding, as well as amendments to the Disability Discrimination Act to include vilification because of disability. Overall, though, the failure of governments to accept the challenge set by the Commission should prompt serious reflection and soul-searching, including in the disability community and by the Commonwealth and state and territory governments who decided to call the Commission. I had a stack of notes to kind of talk about the costs and the opportunity costs of the Commission, and I won't read through them, but we just did some quick sort of back of the envelope numbers that with the funding that you put into the Commission, you could have done something like fund a part-time teacher's assistant to sit in every school, both public and independent, in Australia to support students with disabilities to access mainstream schooling. But there's also a much deeper emotional cost to people with disabilities. So I think it is appropriate that we come together and have a conversation that is a bit of a remonstrance to government for not taking up the recommendations, but also asks where to from here. Our organisations continue to hear and amplify your calls for better rights protections, improved services, fewer barriers, and an end to low pay and segregation. It is important to remember that we were heard in the report, and we were heard particularly, I think, by the commissioners with disability. The path towards change is never linear, and we will regroup and redouble our efforts. To quote Kamala Harris, which feels somewhat impertinent, but anyway, we're not going back. We're not going back to a time where disability was neglected and forgotten and stuck in the policy parking lot. Like that time is in the past now. We're at a tipping point where we've got momentum and we need to keep moving forward. And this is one of the ways that we'll do this. So along these lines, we are today releasing a snapshot report from disability organisations analysing the response to the Commission. It highlights the reforms that the Commission has sought, the priorities from ACT disability organisations, and what was delivered in the response. We hope that it will be a tool to keep government accountable in the many areas where recommendations were agreed in principle. We think the story will be partly how that big block of recommendations where they said we accepted it, but we're not kind of sure it requires further work, how those are implemented will be really important. Events like this are also an opportunity for truth-telling and charting a way forward. To do this, we'd like to invite you to focus on two questions. We'll be popping these in the chat as a bit of a kind of guide stone on the way through. The first is, what do you feel about the government's response? And what would you say if you're attending a meeting of the National Cabinet about it? Secondly, what do we focus on from here? How do we regroup? And where does disability reform go from here? And what we've done in terms of the format of today is we're going to call on people that we've kind of invited to think a bit about this beforehand and then open up the floor to respond to those two questions. And to start us off, I'd like to thank my very good friend and colleague, Dr. Rhonda Galbally, one of the commissioners from the Disability Royal Commission, to start us off and offer some reflections on the response and also where we group and go from here. Over to you, Rhonda. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Craig. And thanks, everybody. And I'd just like to thank everybody, especially for being part of the incredible contribution to the Royal Commission. And, trying to be slightly optimistic. At least there are blueprints and ways forward provided, especially by the three commissioners with lived experience, Barbara Bennett with a daughter with disability and Alastair McEwen and me. And like that is the first time that those blueprints are in such an area such as a Royal Commission. The second thing I'd like to say is that the ACT in education, which was absolutely handballed back to the States, and I'll come back to that in a minute, their response I thought wasn't too bad. Like the scorecard would be Western Australia gets the gold medal, and then it goes down from there. But ACT wasn't nearly as bad as New South Wales or Victoria. So there's room that the door is slightly open, I think, there. So thinking about the 13 recommendations that were agreed to, and Craig's talked about the two that are particularly significant, the DDA and the Migration Act, and then on to the category called subject to further consideration. And the worry about, the well over 100 recommendations in that category is, number one, that they're very significant, many of them, and that in some ways, many of them were no-brainers. And one I'd like to refer to is supported decision-making that goes with guardianship and with public trustee. So it's hard to actually be positive about the results on that area when supported decision-making is still subject to further consideration. Well, why would you need to consider it further? It's absolutely fundamental to have supported decision-making for many areas. Like another area that's a big one that's under subject to further consideration that I feel very angry about is that there's a right to an interpretative declaration on the CRPD for the Australian government. And I just want to tell you what that means. That there we were proudly with Bill Shorten when that government first got in, being one of the first countries to sign on to the treaty. And then the government changed and we had interpretative declarations saying inclusion means segregation. That's what the Australian government said over and over about schools, about sheltered workshops, and about group homes. Then the government changed again, and I hoped that they would stop doing that they would actually say inclusion means phasing out segregation, and we're on a pathway to do that. But instead, the response to the Royal Commission has given the federal government the right to keep going on saying inclusion means segregation. And that omens very badly for us, that they're sort of hanging on to that, because without them being clear that inclusion does mean phasing out segregation, it's no wonder education's been put in the no comment area and handball back to the states. Group homes are in the subject to further consideration and the phasing out of those. And so the work of the Grattan Institute, and you might want them to do a briefing for your members of their approach to a plan to phase out group homes. I think that might be useful because they're putting some meat on the bones of the Royal Commission, trying to at least come up with a plan as to how one would phase out group homes over 15 years. And I think that would be worth considering. And then the other thing that I noted in the too hard basket, subject to further consideration, is that the only group of people in Australia not getting the minimum wage, we've still put that in the subject to further consideration, when it was really well worked out by the Royal Commission how you would phase out and go into a full minimum wage for every worker. It wasn't even, we split the two areas of phasing out sheltered workshops and moving away from the sub-minimum wage, thinking it would be easier for government. And they've still put that in the subject to further consideration when it would have been so easy for them to have agreed to that. So it's like things like not putting disability into the addressing of homelessness in the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. And as Craig commented on forced sterilisation, not even looking at that. Now, I have to mention the education one because I find it completely outrageous that the Commonwealth has not only put that in the no comment area, but also said it's a matter for the states. Well, it is a matter for the Commonwealth as well. And the Royal Commission has recommended that the Commonwealth sets up a national roadmap for phasing out segregation in schools. And we were rightly criticised for allowing 28 years, generations of young people. And we did that to avoid the rejection of it, which is really what the no comment category is. And the Commonwealth then saying it's only a matter for the states without any indication that they would show national leadership on this topic, which is their job. And also, of course, they have all Catholic schools and private schools and could easily put a tag on the huge grants those education systems get to say you must include children with a disability and you can't suspend them and refuse to let them come into the schools or get rid of them around year 10 and 11 because they might bring the scores down to be able to market those schools. So, the Commonwealth has completely avoided their responsibility, and I feel that that's just shocking in a country, and it relates back to the CRPD and to the right the government has kept for itself to keep interpreting the CRPD to mean inclusion can mean segregation, which it doesn't do, according to all the articles and the general comments and all the effort all of us have put into the CRPD over many, many decades. So altogether, I'd like to congratulate the Western Australian government, who I think, have led the way on group homes. They've got the lowest number of group homes and have held the line even with the NDIS pushing group homes onto people. They've really signalled really good effort in education. They're our exemplary state. And I think it's good to have a state that one can sort of congratulate and try and get the other states to catch up. So I thought I'd leave it at that, Craig. And if there's any questions, maybe I can participate in that area.
Thanks, Rhonda. That's been a quite candid but admittedly depressing overview of where we're at. I mean, the ACT used to think we were the exemplary state, and the observation I'd make about education is that the ACT has the words but not the delivery of inclusive education. I'd be interested to hear from you how do we actually get them moving forward on this? And is it about just the political times that we find ourselves in with the Albanese government perhaps being really just scared of doing anything that looks like progressive reform? I'm not asking you to run political commentary, but what is it that we could do as a movement to unglue something that's really very stuck with the Commonwealth clearly just going, we want to revert to the old, pushing stuff back to the states?
Well, I think that the ACT, because you do, it's sort of, I think the topic is systemic advocacy, and you're very good at that. And so I just think we hope the Royal Commission would move it forward sufficiently so that we could focus our efforts on other aspects of our work, but we can't. So, in the education space, I don't know whether you're a member of ACE, the Australian Coalition for Inclusive Education, but if you're not, you should join. All Means All is a really significant organisation. Whether there could be an ACT branch of All Means All, whether they're, I mean, I'm sure you're meeting with your education minister and really trying to shake the trees on that. That would be incredibly useful. In the guardianship area where your Attorney General, supported decision making should just be a no-brainer, a complete expectation now. So picking up the areas that you think are ACT focused and getting a plan around those areas, I think would be really useful, because if the ACT could be, you know, with WA, then that means, you know, that the work then for the other states, you know, South Australia is not too bad in the education area. It's equivocating, but it leaves the door open. Queensland, of course, did a new Education Act a few years ago that's based on the CRPD, a non-interpretive version of it, which is really a really excellent act. It's just that they've had ministers since that time who haven't adhered to their own act. So, Victoria and New South Wales, they're hard. And so you would go to see the union, the teachers union, you would try and make an arrangement with the ACT teachers union that we're all on the same page for human rights. After all, unions always have been. So why can't we get them back on that page for the human rights of children with disability? So there is, really constructive and productive work to do. And you can use the Royal Commission to help with that, I think. But we've got to get the energy back, and it's so demoralising to get a response like this. I mean, I haven't commented on the governance recommendations of the Royal Commission, because I really think my view of governance is that you have to have substance to be governed on. Otherwise, the governance can just be very token. So while the substantive stuff is not good, I mean, subject to further consideration for the government would mean that they might have at the same time outlined their plans, like what are the working parties? How are we going to take these issues forward? Who are we going to involve? What's the timeline? What's the deliverable? But it's just like a vacuum. And so we could be forgiven for feeling that they're trying to push it right off the agenda into the too hard basket. So we absolutely mustn't let them, and I think that's what we've got. We've just got to keep going and work out the coalitions we're going to be part of and when to form our own. Because, some of these issues, there's no coalition. There's not a coalition on group homes in Australia. And I think we need one, really. I think that would be let's try and get some movement on that issue.
Thanks, Rhonda. I think that's good guidance around issues-based coalitions. And in the ACT, we've got things like the inclusive education strategy that at least provide a bit of a point of leverage, even if they're imperfect. So I think that provides us with some important ways forward. We've got some comments in the chat, which I might just pick up and reflect back into the meeting. So Tammy's mentioned that they're very disappointed that the Your Story Disability Legal Service has not been refunded. This means we don't have a national service specific to supporting people with disability. That's certainly something that we are picking up on in our advocacy and feeding back to the national peaks. And goes on about the Your Story Legal Service was a way people used it to give their submissions to the Royal Commission. And it feels like a kick in the stomach. Yeah, we certainly agree with that. I'm next going to call on Pippa Newman there with Women with Disabilities ACT to talk about, I think, some of the perhaps recommendations around gender and violence and other areas where perhaps we haven't seen progress, but also how we regroup and move forward. Over to you, Pippa.
Thanks, Craig. So I'm from Women with Disabilities ACT, and we share all the concerns raised so far by both Craig and Dr. Gloverly. I wanted to speak a bit to how the Disability Royal Commission and response relates to women, girls, and non-binary people specifically. Generally, the Commission as a whole had some gaps in describing or emphasising the experiences of women with disabilities who are more likely to experience unique forms of violence, including domestic, family, and sexual violence, as well as limitations on their reproductive rights. And the Commission didn't adequately reflect our stories that were shared through those extensive consultations over years. So it was no surprise that the government's response to the Disability Royal Commission was also somewhat missing this gendered lens, and was an inadequate response to the urgency of issues facing people with disabilities. So right now I wanted to draw attention to the response to a couple of recommendations. The recommendation to end the legalization of forced or non-therapeutic sterilization, and also the national disability inclusive definition of domestic, sexual, and family violence. So it was recommendation 6.41 that called on all jurisdictions to amend or enact legislation prohibiting non-therapeutic procedures resulting in permanent sterilization of people with disability, originally by the end of this year, by the end of 2024. The ACT was one of only 2 jurisdictions nationwide that accepted this recommendation in principle. All other jurisdictions, including the federal government, listed it as subject to further consideration. And it's really concerning that there hasn't been this national commitment to ending the legalization of permanent forced sterilization. It is great, and we were somewhat surprised to see the ACT government accept this recommendation, even in principle. We'll be watching very closely to see how this will be implemented. We need some more data and information on the prevalence in the ACT. Hopefully this involves working closely with the Human Rights Commission and the existing legislation. But closing legislative loopholes that allow permanent sterilization is something which is long overdue. We're also interested to see if the ACT government takes this opportunity to look further into other practices of sterilization, including non-permanent or chemical sterilization, which also limit the reproductive rights of people with disabilities. Although this wasn't mentioned explicitly in the Royal Commission, it is highly relevant, and it would be great to see the ACT take the lead and set an example for other jurisdictions in tackling this nuanced issue and ensuring the reproductive rights of people with disabilities. So the other recommendation I wanted to speak to was recommendation 8.24 to work towards a nationally consistent disability inclusive definition of domestic and family violence that encompasses forms of violence uniquely experienced by people with disabilities. Such a definition would include things like carer and support worker relationships, as well as violence in domestic settings such as supportive accommodation. And although the federal government accepted this recommendation in principle, the ACT marked it as subject to further consideration, along with pretty much all other states and territories except Victoria. And the lack of a nationally inclusive definition at the moment means it is both harder for people with disabilities, particularly women, to identify their experiences as domestic and family violence and to seek the appropriate supports. And it also means ongoing state responses to gendered violence don't fully address violence against people with disabilities. This is particularly important and pertinent in the ACT because we've just begun a new consultation process for a 10-year domestic, family, and sexual violence strategy. And so it's imperative that this new strategy and the new programs that will hopefully be funded through this 10-year strategy are inclusive of the forms of gender violence that people with disabilities face. So where to from here? I think there is huge opportunity at the moment with the current ACT disability strategies, as well as the disability health strategy and the justice strategy and the new domestic, family, and sexual violence strategy. There's a lot of funding flying around, and it's up to us to ensure it's directed to enact the Royal Commission recommendations and make the strategies generally useful and driving the reform based on what was heard from so many people over the course of the Royal Commission. We're also looking to foundational supports as part of the response to the NDIS review. We're noting that there is some funding allocated starting next year over the next few years for implementation of foundational supports. hopefully this will also introduce additional funding for advocacy and systemic advocacy. So organizations like us, like ACT Down Syndrome and Intellectual Disability and Advocacy for Inclusion can continue to push for reform. That's it from me. I'm looking forward to hearing more recommendations from others and hoping we find a way forward through this.
Thanks, Pippa. Really appreciate that. Next up, we've got a message from Renee from the Disability Reference Group, and that will be read by Carla, and it's very much worth listening to. And it goes to some of the things we've already talked about regarding people's experience of segregation in education. Carla.
Thanks, Craig, and I hope to do justice to the words that Renee has provided for us today. So what do you feel about the government's response, and what would you say if you were attending a meeting of National Cabinet about it? There's a lot of things that I would say, but mostly I would say how disappointed I am and how let down I feel, and not just me, we all do. So much time and effort and so much trauma reduced to the acceptance of just 13 recommendations. And I know there are glimpses of hope and positivity, but it feels really hard to see them right now. This was the moment for Australia to draw a line in the sand and say, we aren't the country, our people are not the people who will ever let these things happen again. I'm not let down for myself, though hopefully I've still got a long life ahead, so of course I want things to be better. But I'm more let down for the children with disability that our government has not stood up to protect today. And this isn't just about stopping bad things from happening to them. This is about telling them that they have value and worth and mean something to all of us, to families, to communities, and our country. Because if we tell children with disability that you can learn, that you can't learn with your peers, that we can help you and nurture you and support you to dream and live just like any other child, then of course they are not happy and healthy kids. They want to be things like the next generation of teachers or doctors or engineers or computer developers or trauma counsellors. If I was in the room, I'd say something like, so many people stood up and told their experiences of a segregated and second-class education. But you, who made decisions on these recommendations, weren't there to hear them. The commissioners were, the people who heard it, but I'm sure you all read the reports. But you weren't in the room. You didn't have to really listen and look those people in the eye. So I ask you now to look me in the eye, because there is something about actually seeing the person, being with them in the same space and seeing their tears in their eyes or hearing the quiver in their voice. It's so much different to reading words on a page or watching it on a screen afterwards. The fact that you have not made it crystal clear to our children with disability and those to come, and to all of Australia right here, right now, that we will no longer accept segregation, separation, exclusion, and a general apathy towards teaching children with disability is a travesty. I came through that system. In fact, I came through one of the best examples of mainstream integration in Canberra. I'm not sure that's exactly true, but it was certainly implied, as the education director had convinced my parents to send me to a school other than my local primary school, away from all the friends I'd made in preschool and those kids in my community and my own siblings. And still, that was horrible. And at the time, you don't think much about it because you're a child with very little understanding of what is happening, let alone why and what could be better. Plus, you're also dealing with a chronic and extremely painful disease in rheumatoid arthritis. I had no idea about the system that was keeping me apart. What I did know was I hated being picked up for hours before my school day started to ride in the white bus to school with no friends, no one even in my own age group. I hated having to leave class and go off for physiotherapy, and worse was hydrotherapy, where I had to undress and be naked in front of all these other kids and adults who I didn't even know. And so much other crap that I didn't have the words to articulate at 7 years old, or even 9 or 10 years old. It hurt me to my core that you are happy for that to continue to children with disability. Even as I write this, there are tears brimming in my eyes. You say you need more time, that we need to consider other perspectives. Why do you? Why isn't the testimony of thousands of people with disability that came through those systems enough? Why is my own story as I speak to you today not enough? Shouldn't we be morally opposed to those behaviours of separation and exclusion? Shouldn't we be centering the voices and experiences of the actual people with disability? But instead, we're listening to who? To teachers, to bureaucrats, to parents who, please don't get me wrong, I'm sure have the best interests of the children at heart, just like my parents did, but it isn't enough. Best interests don't change what I went through or how it made me feel. I don't blame my parents at all, or any of the parents. I blame the system that convinced them it was the right thing to do for everyone. What they meant was it was the right thing to do for everyone else but me. Now it's time to change the system. I know it's going to take time. I know it's hard and big. But without you saying now is the time, that it starts now, and that we will never let a child feel what you felt and still feel today, Renee, ever again. Take a stand. You say you are on the side of the people with disability, but you continue to push our voices back behind the voices of others. So please hear me now. What do we focus on? How do we regroup? And where does disability reform go from here? I'm not super sure where to go from here, but I know we can't stop. We can't be quiet. I unfortunately don't have the time to read all the reports and do a stocktake of all the accepted and accepted in principle and compare between the Commonwealth and the ACT responses. I wish I did, but I don't. So it's times like these that I'm grateful for the hard work that our advocacy organisations do, because I rely on their analysis and their commentary and their positions to help me, inform me, and help me feel like we do have a path forward from here. I'd like to see organisations like AFI create spaces for all of us, like today, to come together and hear from each other and build the solidarity back up. And I know we're not one homogenous group who all think the same, but I feel it's important to build a common platform from which we can all advocate and speak to. I have appreciated some of the shared statements that the peaks here in the ACT have formulated and come together on. If we can do more on that, then I think we still have momentum to not just to support each other, but to affect change. Nothing ever comes easy. We know this. Thank you, Renee.
Yeah, thank you very much, Renee, and thank you, Carla, for a really nice reading of that. It like we actually wanted to ensure the whole thing came into the record. Like that was very much worth listening to, because I think it painted a really powerful picture of the personal impact of these stories and really what segregated education can mean on an individual level. So, it's good that we've actually had that fully read into the meeting. We do have an idea about how we might use some of the stories coming out of today and some of your input that I'll go into it in a bit more detail at the end. But I'd now like to call on Shannon Kolak from ACT Down Syndrome and Intellectual Disability. I suspect, Shannon, that some of what you've just heard around inclusive education would very much resonate with you, but really look forward to hearing what you've got to say on our two questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you to everyone for having me today. The first thing, so I'm the CEO of ACT Down Syndrome and Intellectual Disability. I probably know a lot of you in the room. I wanted to thank everyone, firstly, who gave evidence in the Royal Commission, and I wanted to let people know that regardless of what the outcomes are, we and other disability advocacy groups heard you and will not forget the things that were said, and they are really important to us in our ongoing advocacy. I was going to write some speech about how I felt about the recommendations, but instead what I'm going to do is read you a couple of sentences from Catherine McAlpine's statement. So Catherine McAlpine is the CEO of Inclusion Australia, and she said some really powerful things that really resonated with me and lots of people in our community. So she said, people with intellectual disability are the most heavily and disproportionately harmed by the current state of segregation in Australia. Key recommendations by the Royal Commission, including raising sub-minimum wages and reforms to supported employment and group homes, have all been marked, subject to further consideration. The recommendation to phase out segregated education was noted. Had these and other similar recommendations been accepted in full, Australia would have taken a big leap forward in inclusion. It is heartening to see the government is investing to address negative community attitudes towards people with disability. However, research shows us time and time again that the best way to address negative community attitudes towards people with disability is through direct contact. When you segregate children at age 5 by separating students with an intellectual disability from their age peers, it's no surprise that negative attitudes develop that need to be addressed in the future. Here, with the work that we do, we see time and time again students being segregated from their peers due to something that Renee's statement really drove home, where she wrote, "It was the right thing for everyone but me." And we hear that a lot. We hear the teachers say, "Oh, it's the right thing to do." And we hear parents say, "Oh, it's the right thing for us." What we need to focus on is the child, is the student, is the person with intellectual disability that's being segregated in their workplace, that's being segregated in their school. And I think what Renee said was fabulous. It was perfect. It was really hard to listen to that, actually, and not to be emotional. So I thank Renee for those words. It was wonderful. What I will say, though, about the ACT government's response is that I do feel we're moving in the right direction in terms of responding to so I believe it was 129 recommendations that were specific sort of for the states and territories. Of those particular recommendations, though, whilst a lot of them were either accepted or accepted in principle, I did want to draw your attention to recommendation 7.32, the end of segregated employment by 2034, and saying it's subject to further consideration, and asking basically for the federal government to just deal with that one, to create some sort of a roadmap that they weren't going to do anything to end that sort of segregated employment in the ACT and sub-minimum wages. What would really have been wonderful for the ACT government to do is to be a little visionary on this one and make some recommendations in the ACT to try and move people from segregated employment and sub-minimum wages. I spoke to someone who had previously worked for the NDIS a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about sheltered workshops, and she said to me, "Don't call them sheltered workshops. They're really good, and they should be called disability enterprises, because what they do is they're creating this fabulous thing for families so that a person with an intellectual disability can go to work every day. They can get paid. They don't care how much money they get paid, but mum and dad can go to work, can have their life, siblings can have their life back while the person with a disability is being cared for." And I said, isn't that daycare? And isn't that horrible? That sounds like exactly what Renee said. A sheltered workshop's right for everyone else except for that person with a disability. So that really shocked me. And I really wanted to see the ACT government make a stand about that. I won't go into it anymore. I've got a million stories I could tell you about the things we've heard from people being paid $3 or $4 or $5 an hour for work that should have been paid at, at least minimum wage. I also want to really briefly touch on education. Now, we're really happy that the ACT government accepted quite a few of the recommendations on inclusive education, especially around the right to enrol. These things were already made law and put into our inclusive education strategy. So they kind of got to tick off a few of those things, saying, yeah, we're already dealing with it with the inclusive education strategy. But like everyone, I'm incredibly disappointed around the recommendation 7.41, phasing out and ending specialist segregated education. And for that one just to be noted, and basically for the government to say, oh, we've got a strategy and everyone can enrol in their school and it will all be okay, don't worry about it. And to kind of fob that one off by directing back to the strategy and everyone's right to enrol at their local school. Yes, everyone does have a right to enrol at their local school, but couldn't we have had some vision here in the ACT and say, let's look at a generational response to this and let's work even for the next 20 years to phase out schools and to create a new system of inclusive education. So while I know the ACT Education Directorate and the government is trying, I think it's just not good enough that they have completely fobbed off the idea of creating a better system for the future of our children. In terms of supported decision-making, I know there are some small programs happening and the ACT is working towards a system where supported decision-making will be embedded in law and embedded in all the things we do, but we have a lot more to do in that sort of realm. And I guess we're looking at where to from here. I hope that we can see some increased funding around advocacy, around systemic advocacy, around advocacy organisations to ensure that the government is held accountable on these recommendations, that we can continue to advocate for more change in the ACT. And we also need to make sure that, foundational support, people were saying look into a system where foundational support's adequately funded so that when we can work our way through the ACT recommendations and ensure that things are adequately, implemented over the next few years. So that's kind of what I have to say in terms of us and ACT intellectual disability.
Thanks, Shannon. That was really good and resonates, I think, with our thinking as well. I might just read some things that have come through chat. So Tammy has spoken to subsidised wages and says the subsidised wages upon disclosure of disability is a reality for my children who work for Woolworths. Young people supported by employment access agencies are being forced to accept less than minimum wage, even to work for the Defence Force. I think many Australians only think of sheltered workshops when they think about subsidised wages for people with disability. So a bit of a reminder that this goes outside of the sheltered workshops, or Australian Disability Enterprises, as some like to call them. Ben has made a comment that I think the nub of it goes to the fact that we need to look at why they didn't accept the recommendations that they did. He knows that there were quite a few reasons, complicated legislative issues with individual states, as they are saying, and issues relating to the next election, and them not wanting this to be a strong focus to work on is another, but also about the recommendations that they did accept versus the recommendations they didn't accept, and the contrasting dispositions of power for disabled people versus the non-disabled, and people who already has power over us. That might be a bit complex to digest, but it's worth addressing. I think we would think so too. Like there's a lot behind some of the choices that have been made. Lou Bannister has raised her hand, so I might go to you, Lou.
Thanks, Craig. I'm going back a little bit because I actually wanted to ask a question of what Pippa was saying about the domestic violence strategy. I was wondering whether the ACT government had put their response under further consideration because that strategy work is actually happening and they actually want to work with the community to develop that strategy. This is a question, it's not me saying that's what it is. I'm hoping that's the reason. And the other thing is, I'm aware that we're about to head into caretaker mode here in the ACT in September, and my understanding is that the Commonwealth ministers will be meeting to talk about the commission, the findings again during our caretaker mode, which means that the ACT government isn't in a position to input or respond, which is slightly concerning. And at the risk of bringing in political stuff, I also understand that today the ACT Greens are releasing some more election policy statements, and they're actually calling for a minimum wage for people with disability in that strategy, and they've also got some other excellent things happening. So I can talk to you about that later, Craig. I'm not sure this is an appropriate forum for that. So.
Thanks, Nick. We knew some green stuff was coming today. I hadn't heard the minimum wage call. I heard about an employment strategy or something, but it didn't sound very specific, to be honest. That's better than what we'd heard. Yep. Please send us whatever I think the Greens are going to send us their policy announcement, but anything you've heard, we'd love to see.
Can I have a chat with you afterwards, perhaps?
Yep, I think so. Pippa, I don't know if you wanted to respond a bit to what was said about the strategies as well. People might be briefly offline. Do we have other people that would like to offer some reflections? I know Tammy in the chat was saying that they felt bamboozled by the multiple disability strategies and reviews happening nationally. Just goes on to list a range of them. Everybody in my peer group has fought hard to amplify voices and to share our main points. We've been vulnerable, believing we could make a difference. At every turn, we are told we are someone else's problem. Then talks about feeling like we've been pitted against each other, vying for any kind of assistance, while knowing that our peers with different disabilities were receiving no attention. Even within the autistic community, we've been reduced to othering through fighting for supports through the medical functioning model. We put everything out there, and then goes on to talk about feeling tired and angry. I think we hear that, and we certainly hear also some of that through our advocacy around the NDIS changes and the supports that are happening at the moment. Can I just check in? I'm trying to look at my screen to see if we've got other people. Is there anybody else that wants to offer a reflection or a comment? If not, I might talk a little bit about what happens next with this session. So, first of all, in terms of what happens now, we're having a think about how we use some of the feedback that we've got, as well as the policy work that we've done since the report and the response have been released. One of the options is that today's meeting forms part of a sort of a formal statement. I've called it a remonstrance because I'm currently embedded in English Civil War history, but that might be a bit arcane for people, but a kind of official reproof to government based on listing our concerns and perhaps containing some of the stories. I think some of the things that have been said in chat today, as well as the message from Renee, deserve a bit more airing. So we will have a think about how we do that. It might be something that we deliver to the ACT Chief Minister and to MPs and senators on behalf of the community that invites a further response and makes it really, like, I kind of think we need to chart a way forward, but the community needs to make it clear that we feel that it's not good enough. And we've again, I think, heard that today in the forum. So we'd really like to thank everybody for being so frank and honest with us in your feedback. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Rhonda Galbally for her attendance here today. I'm sure there's many calls on your time following the release of the response, and also our colleagues in DPOs and DROs. So we will keep on this. We're not going to let it go. You know that there's an ACT election coming as well. We're going to be releasing in the next couple of days what we're calling an election hub, which will have information about all of the policy asks from the ACT disability community, and also information about how to be involved in the voting process. So one of the things that's good about the territory is that, for instance, we're the only jurisdiction that's got telephone and online voting and the ability for people who are vision impaired to vote independently, getting out and being part of the election process and amplifying the asks that the disabilities community has come up with, I think is one way that we can continue that work. We've also heard some of the suggestions about forming some strategic themed alliances around some of the issues like education and housing going forward. Some of that work is underway between the DPOs and the GROs, but we will take what you said away and have a bit more of a think about it. So with that, we'd like to thank you all very much for attending and making today really special. We hope you feel heard, and we'll continue to offer these opportunities between now and the ACT election and beyond. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, and thanks
Bye.
to AFI for organising.
Thanks, Shannon. See you in an hour. All right.
Thank
Bye.
you.